Hello and welcome to the Autistic Me Podcast. I am Christopher Scott Wyatt, speaking as the Autistic Me. This episode is one that I've been looking forward to. We are going to be talking with Peter Joseph Gloviczki. Peter is the author of 3 collections of poetry, The Weight of Dandelions, American Paprika, and Kicking Gravity. These were published by Salmon Poetry. His 4th collection, What's Left to the Imagination is Everything, is a forthcoming book from Salmon Poetry, and that should be released in 2023. His poems have appeared in the Beloit Poetry Journal, Hayden's Ferry Review, New Orleans Review, and elsewhere. Peter, welcome to the podcast.
Good morning, Scott. It's great to be with you.
I want listeners to know we've known each other for about a decade.
Yeah, at least. I think we've known each other for at least 10 years.
What we share is a love of literature, poetry, and communication. I am fascinated that poetry is such a large part of your life. It is a significant part of my life. And as I've been studying poetry and autism, I wanted to talk to someone who is both a scholar and a poet who can discuss poetry with us and help situate it as I get ready to interview and talk with autistic poets.
Well, Scott, I'm honored for the invitation and thank you for inviting me to be part of the conversation and to speak with you today. You know, I think poetry is in many ways, right, a form of communication. And I think that when those of us who write poems are moved to engage in this form of creative expression, we are often seeking, I am often seeking to communicate things. Those things may be real, they may be imagined, they may be articulating truths for me or truths for others, but I think poetry is ultimately a form of communication.
My poetic journey, as it were, began in the 4th grade, and I have maintained poetry journals ever since. I collect them and store them away each time one is filled. So there are thousands of pages of mediocre poetry. It's a journaling process for me.
Mm-hmm.
But you have taken it to that next step, and you are a published active poet. What is the distinction that moves someone from that private space of poetry to a public forum of poet?
You know, Scott, I think that's a good question. I have been deeply fortunate in my creative writing to be published in journals, to be published and supported by a wonderful publisher, Salmon Poetry in Ireland. The work that I've been delighted to share with the world is work that I never knew if I would have an audience for. You know, I think the act of being published is one that requires persistence and one that requires determination, but also I've been very lucky. And I'm lucky to have found journal editors who understood and supported what I was saying, and a publisher, Salmon Poetry, that wanted my work to have a broader audience. Like many poets, I am very familiar with the process of submitting work and receiving rejections and submitting again. And over time, I've been lucky to have work accepted, both individual poems and book-length work. You know, I think the separation isn't necessarily even based on the poet or the quality of the work, but I think sometimes it's just luck and persistence. And I know that I've found a regular writing practice to be really helpful. And it's really grounded me in just trying to produce work, trying to communicate work that tied into the timeless themes that I was excited about and curious about. You know, I don't have a first moment that I remember really in poetry. Rather, I have a variety of them. You know, I remember being a college student and then a graduate student and thinking about whether and to what extent I could use creative expression alongside my more critical, more research-oriented work. I work as an associate professor of communication, and I've found that poetry has always been a really great way for me to unplug and to have brief respites from that work that I do, which I also love, but which is different, right? Different from the poetry. I found poetry always gives to me as much as I give to it. I'm fascinated with the concept of brevity, and I'm fascinated with playing with ideas of home and away. What does it mean to be at home or feel at home even during a pandemic? And what does it mean to be away or feel away even during a pandemic? Poetry is a mode of communication that allows me to grapple with, sometimes wrestle with those ideas. And occasionally, I've been able to take those fragments or those concepts and develop them into something that's like a completed poem. And I wanted to just by virtue of just to kind of get our conversation started, I wanted to just share a poem of mine. This is from my first published collection, which is called Kicking Gravity. Came out from Salmon Poetry in 2013. And I wanted to share this poem because I think it speaks to these abstract themes that I've been mentioning quite nicely. This poem is called A Brief Series of Accidents. Snow off the branch and my wet coat, gravel on my lips, skinned sleeves, the first spring day of the year and how the hospital bed felt, what I asked for when I saw you and how all the water ran down my chin. So in a poem like that, I think I'm trying to capture something timeless. That particular scene didn't happen to me specifically, but I'm often inspired by this concept of timelessness, and I hope that my work is relatable, and I hope that I can find images that speak to universal themes about life in ways that inspire readers to go forward perhaps with a new appreciation for simplicity and for everyday pleasures, things like that.
Drawing on your academic background, you are an associate professor of communication at Coker University. You teach about the power of communication, especially in digital settings.
Mm-hmm.
So you are an academic and an artist. And I know there are people who don't believe that's possible, but it is.
Right,
We exist.
right.
But you also then would bring to poetry a self-awareness now that you have the academic background and are a tenured professor.
Sure.
Do you find yourself being introspective as an academic, or do you separate out even without thinking about it as you're writing the poetry? Does that pull you away from the academic mindset?
I found them to be complementary, and I found them to invite one another. So rather than making it harder to do one type of work or the other, I think they complement each other. I find that when I'm writing a lot of scholarship, which, as you mentioned, includes topics like digital memorials, I'm able to write a lot of poetry as well. I think that I often look for points of contact, points of intersection, and even if my poetry is not directly influenced by my scholarship, I'm sure that it is hopefully strengthened. Poets at their best, and I try to be this poet whenever I can, are experts at paying attention, are experts at looking at details, are experts at studying moments and feelings and scenes. All of those tools, all of those strategies, I hope help me be an even more detailed, even more effective, even more efficient researcher in my communication work. I think that the separation of the creative and the critical, that it sometimes works at cross purposes. I hope that when I'm at my strongest as a poet, I'm paying attention not only to poetry, but I hope I'm also paying attention more in my work, more in my interpersonal relationships in life, and more in general. I think paying attention is something that has always served me well, and whatever I'm doing, I try to be as attentive as I can.
Before we return to your work specifically, I received a lot of emails from support providers and educators following the inauguration.
Uh-huh.
People read my blog, The Autistic Me, and they saw that I've shared a few poems here and there, and I've talked about being a poet. And following the inauguration, people were really moved in a way that I had not anticipated.
Mm-hmm.
Amanda Gorman, our youth poet laureate, delivered, it's hard to even put into words how moving it was, how powerful it was. Her work, The Hill We Climb, now has millions of hits on YouTube. It is one of the most popular links on CNN, National Public Radio. I have heard it featured now on other podcasts from across the political spectrum, from across the genre of podcast.
Mm-hmm.
I've now heard this on social podcast, on news podcasts. So this young woman, Amanda Gorman, she has increased the awareness of the rhetorical strength of poetry, the value and power that her eloquence demonstrated, has really brought some attention to poetry in a positive way. And could you, as a communications professor and as a poet, what does that mean to you that the one of the most lingering, one of the most dramatic moments from the inauguration was a young poet?
Scott, I think that's a fascinating moment to study, and I think that one of the things that comes to mind for me as someone who is grateful for the opportunity to be part of both of those worlds, the communication world and the poetry world, is that strong oration and meaningful, dynamic content will capture audiences and capture their attention. And that can be a poem, it can be a newscast, it can be a podcast. I think good content in a meaningful context, in an important context, has the ability to resonate with audiences and has the opportunity to help those audiences make meaning of the significance of the particular moment that's at hand. I think Gorman is a marvelous poet, and I think that she no doubt will have a very long and hopefully a very storied career, both in the public sphere and in any other areas that she wishes to explore. One of the things I think that she captured so well in her inaugural poem is recognizing the pivotal moment at which she was speaking. And I think living in recognition of the setting, the scene, you know more about rhetoric than I do, but I think the sense of, kairos, right? The right place, the right time, those concepts really provided a meaningful stage for the dynamic work that she shared.
About 20 years ago, I was a regular participant in poetry slams, public readings, and I really enjoyed the spontaneity and the intimacy of going into a small cafe, small restaurant, delivering works on the spot. You're given a topic or a theme for the night, you draw out a hat and off you go. And poetry slams are something I really enjoy watching. We've now, 20 years later, moved into this digital realm where I'm looking at, as I said, Amanda Gorman has millions of people watching this poem. So we've gone from, and I think there's value in both, that wonderful intimacy of a reading in a bookstore or a cafe to this digital platform that many are finding that wouldn't have a physical platform otherwise.
Mhm.
Suddenly you can reach millions instead of struggling to get to a cafe because you might be disabled, you might have mobility issues, or it can be as simple as you can't get on a bus and get to somewhere because of public transit. The internet has allowed people to share their poetry and their prose with literally millions in an instant.
Yeah. Online communities in particular, and the networked environment in general, they sure do allow poetry different audiences and hopefully broader audiences than during a pre-internet, pre-social media moment. And I think that on the whole, that's a very promising development. You mentioned slam poetry. I'm reminded of the slam poet Taylor Mali, whose famous poem, What Teachers Make, went viral online. And I think that poetry allows for the presentation of ideas in a context where the audience can really feel the emotions of the orator, right? The audience can really feel the emotions. I certainly felt that Amanda Gorman, as the orator, was extremely honored and excited to be sharing her wonderful words, rather, during the inauguration. And I think this sense of emotion comes through all the more because of digital landscapes, because of digital spaces. Indeed, the world is in some ways more accessible to all of us across a host of potential barriers. And I think that the idea of being open to active engagement, the idea of really being aware of what's out there online, is something that has potential to strengthen poetic voices and hopefully to build diverse, inclusive communities that might not have been possible as easily in earlier moments.
I love hearing the poet deliver the poet's work and coming across some of the early recordings of Langston Hughes. Audio, hearing that passion in the voice makes it different than just reading it on the page. And I think you're right. Amanda Gorman delivering her work made that work something else than just the words on a page.
Yes, I agree.
And yet at the same time, poetry, there are visual works where the words on the page and the arrangement of the words, the style of the typography is itself the expression.
Right,
So,
right.
so poetry has this presentation as oratory, presentation as words, presentation as visual art, audio art. It has all these different existences.
Yes.
You can't say a poem is this rhyming thing that we're going to read in class
Yeah. Yeah.
because that's only one of hundreds of ways we can experience a poem.
There are so many ways to engage, to experience, to make sense of, to bring meaning to poetry. I'm reminded of the wonderful poems of David James Savarese and the ways that he, as a non speaking autistic individual, is able to really convey timeless, necessary, insightful ideas. I think that poetry, in its best moments, is about that which unites us. And I think poetry, in its best moments, reminds us all what we have in common and reminds us all, whether we are Amanda Gorman, whether we are David James Savarese, or whether we are anybody else. I think poetry reminds us what we might have in common and what might help us come together in new and novel ways. You were talking earlier about the internet, and I think it has so much potential. In general, I am very optimistic about the internet. But I think we've seen that the internet can provide platforms for hate. The internet can and does provide platforms for divisive ways of thinking and ways of knowing the world. And I tend to always remain mindful of the fact that the internet is a space that is very much influenced by its users. And the internet is very much a space that can be influenced by those who engage upon it. And so I think the content that is shared is just as important as the medium itself.
When we look at your works, you have discussed this as place.
Uh-huh.
Even the titles, American Paprika,
Uh-huh.
Kicking Gravity, The Weight of Dandelions, all of these connect to location in some way.
Uh-huh.
Can you explain that relationship to place a bit more and maybe share something from American Paprika with us?
I'd be happy to, Scott. Thank you for the invitation to do that. I think place is always part of the writing that I do in some way or another. And my favorite places to inhabit as a poet are imagined places, which is to say, they are imagined for me. I am rarely the speaker in any of my poems. In a way, this provides a great deal of freedom because I can visit places that I never was and imagine what that would be like. One example of this is in my poem Coffee from American Paprika, which is published by Salmon Poetry in 2016. We met for coffee and talked about nothing over onion rings. It was just what we needed. Then we ordered curly fries and shared Kennedy stories. I was on my 8th grade field trip to the Science Museum. You were hanging streamers in the high school gym before a pep rally. We both cried when we heard the news. I was in front of the dinosaur exhibit as I watched the bones go blurry. You dropped a pair of scissors and heard them hit the gym floor. And I think that place, real or imagined, current or historical, place is something that reminds us that across the human experience, we are all always somewhere. What I mean is that we're influenced by, we're motivated by, we're sometimes stifled by our places. And I think that there's value for me in being aware of that. Recognizing that fact in my own writing, I think, has encouraged me towards places that are generative, places that are exciting, places that are inviting and accepting. I think that I try to write in a way where I'm mindful of place and also reflecting upon it. I'm reminded of the poet Mary Oliver, for example, who wrote extensively about some of the places in her life and whose work, I think, is often connected to those places. Place for me is often inspiring, and it's a way that I can tie the work that I do to meaningful locations. Hopefully, the locations that are meaningful for me have some meaning and resonance with audiences as well.
I bring up place and space in part because, well, I was working on my dissertation 10 or 11 years ago now. I used the book Autism and Representation, and there's a chapter, Imagination and the Awareness of Self in Autistic Spectrum Poets by Alona Roth. And the chapter looks at word choices and topic choices. One of the concepts they found recurring was place or space. I think it's something of a disservice to say, oh, look, the autistics write about place and space when I think by nature poets are interested in where and when they are. I don't know how else to say it. It just struck me as odd. Oh, look, the autistic poets are interested in place. And I'm thinking, there are a lot of great poems about a lot of very specific places or settings, or I don't know. It just struck me as an interesting perspective when I'm speaking as someone who is diagnosed autistic who writes poetry. And of course, I write about places and spaces. I write sitting outside looking at streams or sitting in the mountains. Of course, I'm going to write about them.
Place is a universal tool in every poet's catalog across the human experience. I have cerebral palsy, which is a disability that affects my balance, stamina, and coordination. And I wonder if that has any impact on how I write. I'm not sure that I'm the right person to be able to answer that question either way. No, I've never thought about myself as a poet with cerebral palsy or a disabled poet or a poet from any of those communities. I've thought of myself as a poet, which is to say that even though those elements might be important parts of my life in some ways, I think poetry to me has always been an opportunity for a sort of equalization. And I think poetry, in its best moments, lends itself to a kind of equity, which is to say, whoever you are and wherever you've been, poetry is a place that you can come to find home and come to find belonging and come to find inclusion. It worries me when broad labels are placed upon groups, whether it's groups of poets or groups of people. When we say these people are always like this or those people are always like that, I think it's a very misguided concept. And I think poetry allows us, it certainly allows me, to look for, again, that sense of universality. I worry that separating groups based on any specific characteristic doesn't allow the uniqueness and individuality of individuals who are part of those groups to really make themselves and make their voices heard. I hope that I am a I am seen creatively as a poet first, and that any other descriptors about me serve only to complement the work rather than to define it.
I believe that my poetry, particularly because it's only meant for my journals for the most part, is often observational. And I am writing about the people and the places I see around me. I would like to think that I'm not writing as an autistic, an academic, or whatever. I am all those things, and those are certainly shaping what I'm writing. But what I'm trying to do when I write is to study, to find that one word that captures what I'm seeing. It can be as simple as talking about a crack in a white wall
Mm,
in a classroom. Well, okay, yeah, I'm writing about a crack in a wall, but and yes, that's a place. It's a classroom, it's a cracked wall, and I'm trying to record and communicate the um, I don't want to say neglect or but that really is a good word for it.
mm,
When you're in an inner city school and you see the cracked walls, that to me is I'm trying to convey something much bigger, but I'm trying to find a word or two
mm.
that embodies what I might write an essay about for an academic journal.
Yeah.
To me, that's what a poet does, and I think you could explain this process too, because I know you've done haiku and other short forms. I'm trying to capture in a very few words a much bigger story, and that to me is not about my disability or my struggles with language. That is what I think all good poets do.
For me, short poems have always been inviting because the opportunity to express a great deal in just a few words is something that has always stimulated and excited me. I wanted to share a haiku of mine from my collection, The Weight of Dandelions. This came out from Salmon Poetry in 2019. Queen size bed, the dog lets me sleep there too. In just short poems like that, I think finding that which is something that the audience can carry into their daily lives. How many of us have experiences with our pets where we've experience something like that, right? It's this funny little moment, this funny little vignette, and it might make us chuckle, it might make us laugh, it might make us remember the pets that we grew up with. It might make us long for pets who are no longer with us in the earthly world. I think short expression is expression that is all the more powerful for its brevity, all the more powerful because it worked to say something in just a few utterances. I often return myself to the brevity of others, the ways that poets and writers have found just the right thing to say in just the right moment. Stephen Dobbins is a poet and a creative writer who's stimulated my own work very much. And I think the excitement I get in Dobbins' work is that same attention to how can I use just this page or just these phrases to communicate everything that I want to say. Those sorts of models and previous examples have really helped me feel comfortable engaging brevity, feel comfortable with that. I think as a writer, I often need permission from those who came before me to do the things that I really want to do. I personally, as a poet, need to feel as though I'm benefiting from the work of others to really find my voice. I've been extremely happy to read much of the work of not only Stephen Dobbins, but also the poet Billy Collins, the poet Robert Pinsky, as well as poets such as Sharon Olds, one of my teachers, Kim Adonisio, among many, many others. I think their examples have helped me find ways that I can employ literary tools, whether it's brevity or repetition or whatever the tool is. I think some of those great examples have really helped me go forward and find my voice and feel comfortable with my own voice over time.
As I write, I often look back at what I have been reading, and I certainly am shaped by the poetry of Phil Levine and some of the Western poets as well. My family migrated to California from Arkansas and worked in the farms. My grandmother was a farm worker, and I have found that the poetry connects me in a way that maybe a work like The Grapes of Wrath can do, but the poetry actually connects me in some ways more powerfully, more intimately.
There is a sort of intimacy that's possible in poetry. It is possible to convey things that might be somewhat more difficult in other forms of expression. I've been extraordinarily fortunate in my life to be raised by two parents, my mother and my father, who have always been and still are to this day so supportive of the work that I do. And I'm a person who has always benefited from an incredible support system even beyond family. I have colleagues and friends who I really hold dear, and I think those communities have been so sustaining to me. They've allowed me to reach heights and look for ways forward in ways that made it such that if I faltered or stumbled, I knew I was going to be able to get up. And I think the benefit of those supportive spaces is that I've learned it's okay to fail, because if I fail, I always have somewhere to go back to. And I think at its core, that assurance allows me to play when I write, to create and realize that maybe this version, maybe this draft, maybe this iteration of something is not there yet. I've learned that that's okay because I have people in my life who will and do always care and will and do always love me. That's an incredible gift. And I say that in all seriousness because it's an opportunity to try and try again. There's the famous Beckett phrase, fail again, fail better, right? And I'm getting the phrase wrong, so I apologize to any Beckett scholars, but that's the concept, right? That failure is just the opportunity before the next success. And failure is just what happens while you're getting to where you are going. The support I have from those I hold closest has allowed me to always keep going. And I'm deeply fortunate for that.
I want to conclude with your thoughts on poetry as an equalizer. In Roth's essay, one thing that I do agree with was that poetry allows us to move beyond the rigid rules of academic prose or journalism or other forms of narrative writing. Poetry is unconstrained. And whether you're a nonverbal autistic or deaf or part of the blind community, poetry is open to everyone because it takes so many different forms. And I would like both your creative and your academic insights on that idea that poetry is accessible and we need to teach it in that way. Right now, we often present poetry as this thing that we force people to read, or outside of the fun child poets, like the Dr. Seuss's, we make poetry some sort of mythical mountain to climb for students, when I know that poetry is accessible and everyone can do it. I do it for myself. I'm not doing it for publication. My children are starting to like to write because they see me write. How do we bridge that gap and spread the message that I do think Roth's work gets right, which is that equality, that approachability of poetry?
Scott, I think that's a great question. And I'm not a scholar of creativity, but I think that the best thing someone who feels moved to write, whether they are 3 or 93, the best thing for that person is to begin writing and begin trying and begin making the attempt. Because I think that all of the accolades, all of the recognition, all of the publications, and I've been very fortunate to have a lot of each of those things, but all those things are things that come later. I have found that poetry is always there for me. It's always there for me as almost as if it was a friend or a confidant. I think the best thing for anybody who wishes to write is to start writing. I think that there are so many ways to write a good poem. I tend to write short poems, but I'm envious and happy for those who wish to express themselves in longer poems. I wish I had that skill. I don't. The only rules in poetry are the ones that the poet imposes upon themselves. Certainly, there are forms of poetry, there are styles of poetry, there are certain established norms and ways of being in the poetic community, especially in the Western world. But I think all those things should be secondary to the poet wishing to engage in creative expression. I think beginning with that desire, beginning from that curiosity, that's the only requirement, and perhaps the most important requirement, for anybody who wishes to express themselves creatively, that they desire to do so. In doing so, I have found that creativity strengthens the other elements of my life. Creativity has strengthened the work I do as a teacher. Creativity has probably made me a better person, given me a fuller sense of empathy of and recognition for the other. And I think those values, they transcend anything else about creative expression or creative success. I think if one wishes to write poems, I would encourage them wholeheartedly on that journey. And the things like publication or success, those may or may not come, but I don't think they should ever be the defining factors in the value of poetry. I think poetry is valuable for those who do it because they engage in that activity and because they desire to set out on that journey. I hope to always write poems, and I am someone who hopes that the poems will always keep coming. I'm sure that as long as I am able to, I will keep writing, and I hope for everyone who has similar aspirations and desires that they can think of the poetry that they write and the poems that they publish, as well as those that they write for themselves, as works that strengthen their lives and bolster their hopes for the future. I mean, poetry, in so many ways, can and perhaps should be aspirational. It should remind us of what is possible. Poetry has often reminded me of what is possible, and for that I am deeply grateful.
I want to thank you for taking the time to join the podcast as a poet. I know you mentioned that you would like to be known as a poet and creative writer, not by your disabilities or your differences or other traits. I really enjoy hearing and reading your works. We're blessed that you and I have been exposed to so many wonderful academics and creatives throughout our lives. And I know that this podcast and technology are now letting us reach people who may have previously not had those opportunities. I encourage listeners of this episode, go onto YouTube, look for kinetic poetry or kinetic typography, look for famous poets on YouTube, look in online forums for poets, listen to their works, read their works. I know that it still requires technology, and that's still a barrier, but there's far more access now than ever in human history. And there's so many wonderful works. I check out works now from the library digitally. It's free, it's wonderful. And I couldn't have done that and wouldn't have really thought about it 4 years ago, 5 years ago. Now, with the pandemic, I'm doing a lot of research digitally, and I'm just discovering so many great and wonderful voices in communities that I had not thought about in terms of their poetry and their creative output. And so I think we're living in a great time for this access to other people's poetry and poetic thoughts.
Yeah, Scott, I mean, I think you're exactly right. Last month, I was honored to be part of the Carolina Poets Reading Series, which is based out of Asheville, North Carolina, in the United States, but it's accessible to anybody on YouTube. And if you go to YouTube and you search for the phrase Carolina Poets, you will find several of the wonderful readings that have been curated there. The poetry reading from mid-January that I was honored to be a part of is also available there. But I think the internet is making possible access to voices and authors and schools of thought in the poetry world that would have otherwise been more difficult to access. And I think in that way, poetry is available to audiences that might not even have known about it before. So I encourage everyone to, just as you're saying, go on YouTube, look for the poems and the poets and the ideas that inspire you, and to allow poetry into your life in the way that you feel moved to do so. I've always found poetry to be generative and exciting and something that strengthens and sustains the work that I'm doing. And I hope the same is true for you.
I know that from the first time I started writing into my journal with poetry, that it was a revelation that it didn't have to follow the rules I was being taught in class. It didn't have to be a Shakespearean sonnet. It didn't have to be a classical haiku. It could be mine. I could experiment with punctuation like Cummings. I could experiment with emotion like Browning. There's just so much you can do, and you don't have to know the academic history. You don't need to be steeped in tradition. Just sit down and write.
That's a great concept, that if you feel like you want to try poetry, give it a try and see where it takes you, and allow that experience to unfold as it will. I think that your listeners might find that it moves them to explore in ways they perhaps wouldn't have done otherwise. And I think that's an exciting and an affirming practice.
I want to thank Peter Gloviczki for joining us on the Autistic Me. Peter is the author of the poetry collections, The Weight of Dandelions, American Paprika, and Kicking Gravity. They are available from Salmon Poetry. Peter, are those also available on Amazon and other online bookstores?
Yes, they're available broadly, and I would encourage everyone to go to salmonpoetry.com. They are a wonderful press, and they have really put together a great website. On that website, you can learn more about the 3 books that I've read from today. And if you find yourself after the pandemic in Ireland, you should also visit the Salmon Bookshop, because I think it's great to have a sense of not just poems online, but poetry books in the world as well. Thank you, Scott, for the opportunity to chat together. I really enjoyed it, and I hope that we inspired some of your listeners to take up poetry. And I hope that we inspire future authors as well.
I look forward to attending a reading sometime other than virtual. Watching a reading on YouTube is wonderful, and I do love it. I love how many voices I'm seeing. But there is that part of me that really misses sitting in a small bookshop or a small cafe and hearing the poet. There is something about that intimacy that I personally find lacking online. But online, I'm finding people I would have never found before.
I think each setting has its benefits and drawbacks, of course, but I agree with you that there is something special about the in-person poetic experience, and I look forward to a post-pandemic moment when we can all enjoy that setting together.
I want to thank again Peter Gloviczki, poet, scholar, and just all around a wonderful human being. Thank you for joining us on the Autistic Me Podcast.
Thank you, Scott.